courage in defying her, and sometimes our vanity was increased by our moniteurs. After an exciting misadventure they often gave expression to their relief at finding an amateur pilot still whole, by praising his presence of mind in too generous French fashion. We should not have been so proud, I think, of our own exploits, had we remembered those of the pioneers in aviation, so many of whom lost their lives in experiment with the first crude types of the heavier-than-air machines. They were pioneers in the fine and splendid meaning of the word, men to be compared in spirit with the old 15th-century navigators. We were but followers, adventuring in comparative safety along a well-defined trail. This, at any rate, was Drew's opinion. He would never allow me the pleasure of indulging in any flights of fancy over these trivial adventures of ours. He would never let me set them off against the heroic background of Paris. As for Paris, he saw nothing of war there, he would say, except the lighter side, the homecoming, leave-enjoying side. We needed to know more of the horror and the tragedy of it. We needed to keep that close and intimate to us as a right perspective for our future adventures. He believed it to be our duty as aviators to anticipate every kind of experience which we might have to meet at the front. His imagination was abnormally vivid. Once he discussed the possibility of falling in flames, which is so often the end of an airman's career. I shall never again be able to take the same whole-hearted delight in flying that I did before he was so horribly eloquent upon the subject. He often speculated upon one's emotions in falling in a machine damaged beyond the possibility of control. "Now try to imagine it," he would say. "Your gasoline tanks have been punctured, and half of your fuselage has been shot away. You believe that there is not the slightest chance for you to save your life. What are you going to do? Lose your head and give up the game? No, you've got to attempt the impossible," and so on and so forth. I would accuse him of being morbid. Furthermore, I saw no reason why we should plan for terrible emergencies which might never arrive. His answer was that we were military pilots in training for combat machines. We had no right to ignore the grimness of the business ahead of us. If we did, so much the worse for us when we would go to the front. But beyond this practical interest, he had a great curiosity about the nature of fear, and a great dread of it, too. He was afraid that in some last adventure, in which death came slowly enough for him to recognize it, he might die like a terror-stricken animal, and not bravely as a man should. We did not often discuss these gruesome possibilities, although this was not Drew's fault. I would not listen to him, and so we would be silent about them until convinced that the furtherance of our careers as airmen demanded additional pleasant imaginings. There was something of the Hindoo fanatic in him, or perhaps it was the outcropping of the stern spirit of his New England forebears. But when he talked of the pleasant side of the adventure before us, it was more than compensation for all the rest. Then he would make me restless and impatient, for I did not have his faculty of enjoyment in anticipation. The early period of training, when we were flying only a few meters above the ground, seemed endless. At last came the event which really marked the beginning of our careers as airmen, the first tour de piste, the first flight around the aerodrome. We had talked of this for weeks, but when at last the day for it came, our enthusiasm had waned. We were eager to try our wings, and yet afraid to make the start. This first tour de piste was always the occasion for a gathering of the Americans, and there was the usual assembly present. The beginners were there to shiver in anticipation of their own forthcoming trials, and the more advanced pilots, who had already taken the leap, to offer gratuitous advice. "Now don't try to pull any big league stuff. Not too much rudder on the turns. Remember how that Frenchman piled up on the Farman hangars when he tried to bank the corners? You'll find it pretty rotten when you go over the woods. The air currents there are something scandalous. Believe me, it's a lot worse over the fort. Rough. Ooh la la. And that's where you have to cut your motor and dive, if you're going to make a landing without hanging up in the telephone wires. When you do come down, don't be afraid to stick her nose forward. Scare the life out of you. That drop will, but You may as well get used to it in the beginning. But wait till we see them redress. Where's the Oriental wrecking gang? Don't let that worry you, Drew. Pancaking isn't too bad. None of it'll be right. Just like falling through a shingle roof. Can't hurt yourself much. If you do spill, make it a good one. There hasn't been a decent smash-up today." These were the usual comforting assurances. They did not frighten us much, although there was just enough truth in the warnings to make us uneasy. We took our hazing as well as we could inwardly, and, of course, with the imperturbable calm outwardly. But to make a confession, I was somewhat reluctant to hear the businesslike "Allez en route" of the Moniteur. When it came, I taxied across to the other side of the field, turned into the wind, and came racing back full motor. It seemed a thing of tremendous power, that little 45 horsepower Anzani. The roar of it struck awe into my soul, and I gripped the controls in no very professional manner. Then, when I had gathered full ground speed, I eased her off gently, and up we went, over the class and the assembled visitors, above the hangars, the lake, the forest, until at the halfway point my altimeter registered 350 meters. Out of the corner of my eye I saw all the beautiful countryside spread out beneath me, but I was too busy occupied to take in the prospect. I was watching my wings nervously in order to anticipate and counteract the slightest pitch of the machine. But nothing happened, and I soon realized that this first grand tour was not going to be nearly so bad as we had been led to believe. I began to enjoy it. I even looked down over the side of the fuselage, although it was a very hasty glance. All the time I was thinking of the rapidly approaching moment when I should have to come down. I knew well enough how the descent was to be made. It was very simple. I had only to shut off my motor, push forward with my broomstick, the control connected to the elevating planes, and then wait and redress gradually. Beginning at from 6 to 8 meters from the ground, the descent would be exciting, a little more rapid than shooting the chutes. Only one could not safely hold on to the sides of the car and await the splash. That sort of thing had sometimes been done in aeroplanes by overexcited pilots. The results were disastrous, without exception. The moment for the decision came. I was above the fort. Otherwise, I should not have known when to dive. At first the sensation was, I imagine, exactly that of falling, feet foremost. But after pulling back slightly on the controls, I felt the machine answer to them, and the uncomfortable feeling passed. I brought up on the ground in the usual bumpy manner of the beginner. Nothing gave way, however, so this did not spoil the fine rapture of a rare moment. It was shared, at least it was pleasant to think so, by my old Annamite friend of the Penguin experience, who stood by his flag, nodding his head at me. He said, "Beaucoup bon," showing his polished black teeth in an approving grin. I forgot for the moment that "beaucoup bon" was his enigmatical comment upon all occasions, and that he would have grinned just as broadly had he been dragging me out from a mass of wreckage. Drew came in a few moments later, making an almost perfect landing. In the evening we walked to a neighboring village, where we had a wonderful dinner to celebrate the end of our apprenticeship. It was a curious feast. We had little to say to one another, or, better, we were both afraid to talk. We were under an enchantment which words would have broken. After a silent meal, we walked all the way home without speaking. We started off together on our triangles. That was in April just past, so that I have now brought this casual diary almost up to date. We were then at the great school of aviation at A, in central France, where for the first time we were associated with men in training for every branch of aviation service, and became familiar with other types of French machines. But the brevet test which every pilot must pass before he becomes a military aviator were the same in every department of the school. The triangles were 2 cross-country flights of 200 kilometers each, 3 landings to be made en route, and each flight to be completed within 48 hours. In addition, there were 2 short voyages of 60 kilometers each. These preceded the triangular tests, and an hour of flight at a minimum altitude of 6,500 feet. The short voyage